Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt is from Hank. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about objective fun. Hank says, I'm going to snag your objective fun thought bubble. Thought bubbles are the little Parley prompts I give at the beginning of each month in case people want an idea for theirs. What are the ways in which we can narrow down what will likely be fun for other people without, simultaneously being multiple people? Yep, sure, got it. Obviously, since this is one of the prompts I wrote, so if people want to request the parlay but they don't want to come up with an idea, I'm happy to offer you some. Well, you're free to request whatever you want. I do have some ideas already because it was my idea for a prompt, but I don't have that many. We're gonna see in this parlay if I can think of more better ones. And really, a lot of my ideas are kind of linear. Like I'm gonna give you three, but they're kind of you should realize this one, and then you would then go on to do this one, and then go on to do this one. I'm not sure it fully counts as three. It's kind of three breakpoints in the same thought process. So we'll see. I'm sure I'll think of more as we go. Okay, so just starting very simple. Let's say you're a game developer and you haven't really thought about this subject at all. And that's okay. A pretty common thing in art in general, as well as in game design, it's a big deal in game design, is the divide between making your art, as it were, making the thing that you have inside you, that is what you want to say, to show to other people. And then what might be interesting to them is they get to kind of go through a tableau of what somebody else thought. Very interesting, not bad. But then there's also what would other people want to see from my perspective, or that I can sort of show them deliberately. Not really from, using my perspective. And in most game design, it necessarily strays more toward this second idea, because your art that you're making for people, if you consider your game design to be art, is something that they have to operate. They have to do things with it. They have to play the game. And thus, it's more important that it be less self-centered in the sense that the gameplay is something you're making other people do. If you make something and don't think at all about what other people will do with it when they get it, well, they're probably not going to like it. Interestingly, to me, a lot of games that don't seem very aware of kind of like quality of life stuff, it's not like you could play the game and not have this problem. It's not like there's a perspective where you would play the game and this wouldn't be annoying, if that makes sense. It's something that would bother everyone, but I guess they just didn't prioritize that with the limited development time they had. That's okay. But it's just interesting how a lot of the times in I think games are fairly objective, is basically what I'm trying to say. It's surprising often how much, for an individual part of a game's design, there is a seemingly pretty objective way to do it. It's not that up to interpretation that it would be better to just do it this way. So the first thing that you can do, of course, taking that as a prompt, is to just know that you have preferences that are not objective. To just be willing to admit, probably for most of you, this elicits an eye roll, you're beyond this point, but to acknowledge that you like things that not everybody would like, and they're not wrong or ignorant for not liking them. You might be wrong or ignorant for currently enjoying those things, though we'll get to that later. But for now, it's sufficient to say, just to acknowledge that you don't know everything you would like, and other people don't either. But just because you like this thing doesn't mean people are just wrong or ignorant of it if they don't like it. They might just like different things. To flip it around, why do you like the thing that you like? Why do you like that thing? I'll just give a few common examples of places where I've seen this be a problem for people. One really classic one is that it'll be a multiplayer game and people will say, I really just like playing this with my friends. I hope it's obvious that that's not a statement about the game, but people tend to treat it like it's one. Or if people say that game isn't that fun because of this design problem it has, or this is a bad thing about the design of that game, people tend to push back and say, no, because I had fun with the game, therefore your criticism has to be wrong, because I have proof from my own experience that the game is fun. No, you have proof from your own experience that you are fun in this game. You can have fun. Your friends can have fun with you in this game. That's a good thing, but it's a good thing about you, not necessarily a good thing about the game. It might be a good thing about the game. The game might be bringing those qualities out for you, but a lot of the time people say it's that and don't really interrogate it that much as well. People will say things like, I laughed so much, like at the game or in this game. And again, you can dig in a little bit and say, okay, you don't have to be a game designer. You can just say that and it doesn't matter. It's fine. That's obviously fine. It's great you had fun with the game. But here in Game Design Corner for this parlay, we can ask, but is it because of this specific game? Does this game's design need to be this way for you to feel that way? An example that comes to mind for me is in Remnant 2, where a lot of items are hidden behind these very esoteric puzzles. Figuring out a very contrived, annoying piece of game design with a friend can be really fun. More fun than if it wasn't contrived. But I don't think that that's an argument that that game design is good. I feel like it's just maybe the difficulty could have been coherent, like, and then it still would have been fun. It being that the most of the game is easy, but then there are hard parts of the game that are contrived, doesn't make making them contrived good. I would argue that just means that a little more difficulty would have been nice. The game was maybe just too easy previously. And I've had this experience with a lot of friends. Not naming names. If some of my friends watch Parley, so I'm not trying to call anyone out or anything, we talk about this. That's how I am with my friends, so you already know I think this. But it is common that friends of mine will want a difficulty lower than the difficulty I would suggest. Obviously, I play video games for a living, so even though I'm not like some kind of hit scan god, when we play a shooting game, for example, I think I am better than average among my friends at those things. So that might be a reason why they would be inclined to do an easier difficulty than I would suggest. I'm not trying to be high and mighty when I say this, but I'm often correct that that was a little too easy. And we then have a lot of fun at the parts where it's harder. But it's usually harder on an easier difficulty when the game design is just kind of janky. So we have to struggle through it. That's not fun because it's good for the design to be that way. It's fun because we would have had more fun if we played a higher difficulty, but we didn't. So this is the only remaining hard part. That's hard even if you're skilled. That's not fun. You're good at the thing, and your skill isn't rewarded. That's bad. I would hope people would agree. But this game has some design elements that are like that. Remnant 2 is no particular offender here. It's just the game that I've experienced this a lot with. And I've seen a lot of defense of a lot of the game's design that boils down to this issue. You know, people saying, I had a good experience with this, and it's contrived and difficult and annoying, but it has to be that way to make that good experience. And because it's a little bit more complicated than just their fun with their friends, they don't see that it really isn't because the design is contrived. They probably would have been able to have that same fun if they just played a harder difficulty. Again, this is just one example, but hopefully this is to some effect to get people to see that maybe what they like about the game isn't like the game as much as their perspective on the game. And again, this is very good. You had real fun. Your fun was real. Saying that this part of the design isn't good doesn't mean you didn't have the experience you had. Obviously, I would hope. And I'm not going to coddle the audience anymore. I'm going to assume that you know that because, to be blunt, it's pretty immature not to be able to acknowledge that. So let's move on, but that's one common one that I've noticed. Another one is just perspective. This is where a game that has some problem if you've played like more games, often more games like it, isn't clear if you haven't played more games like it. There's kind of two primary ways I see this happen. So one of them is turn-based games, I think, are really guilty of this. Turn-based combat, turn-based role-playing games where you level up a party. It's often story-driven. You get items as you go. You can often make a build to some extent, although I often find the build systems in these a little yawn-inducing, a little similar and simple. They often have this problem where at the end of a round of turn-based combat, it is tactically clear that you are going to win, like you've won. You've gotten over kind of the big thrust with the enemy, but they're not technically dead yet. Because it's turn-based combat, the rest of the fight is often pretty slow, and some games have cleverly found ways to speed up or kind of pass through this part because it's boring to a lot of people. You could probably see where I'm going with this. A lot of people are quite apologetic for these parts of games, and it's simply because they just haven't played enough of them to be annoyed by that aspect of the game. They'll say something like, they don't say it's not bad, they'll just say, I didn't mind. And it's like, okay, that's really good. But again, it's a good thing about you. It's still bad that the game doesn't have a way to fill that design problem that, basically every turn-based everything ever has. That is bad. That's quite bad. But it's good that you are not annoyed by it. That's excellent. Hopefully, game design will advance enough that you won't have to deal with it by the time you are annoyed by it. And I would wish in a perfect meditation plane world that those people would have the foresight to say, even though it didn't bother me, this is bad because it's gonna bother me in the future. And to not feel like they're making a problem when they say that. And that's what I think it is a lot of the time. People, you're not beating up on a game if you're genuinely trying to make the industry better and have more fun. If you think, you predict as well as you can tell from your perspective that something would be bad, it's okay to say, I wonder if this could be better. You don't have to be a jerk to say something is bad. It's okay. It's not bad to criticize things. People who can't take criticism that is genuinely coming from a place of being productive without being defensive are maybe the ones who are not doing as great of a job. But indeed, a lot of criticism is vitriolic and unintelligent. It's just mean for no reason, sure. But a lot of the time, it's stuff like that. Basically, people haven't been worn out by a thing in a genre, but it really is that the genre kind of could use to figure that out. A good example for me would also be something like Pokemon games, where I could imagine everyone who's played, like all of them, well, I don't know, maybe they're evidently not sick of that because it's been kind of the same the whole time. But people will often criticize these things, and people who've only played a few will say, well, I didn't think that was annoying. I'm not sick of it. Who cares that they're all like the same? Why are you so negative about that? We like them. And it's like, okay, well, you might feel differently if you played 4 or 5 and wanted them to progress, but they didn't. And likewise, people who've played literally all of them, well, evidently they don't find this thing to be a problem, but that doesn't mean it's a good thing about the design. Would it have been bad? Would they have disliked all those games if they had different design? Finally, an example that hits close to home, because Hank, I know you're interested in this game. Monster Hunter is a game I think has a huge problem with this. Many of the Monster Hunter games I've played over the years, I haven't really enjoyed any of them at all. In fact, they've been some of my least favorite successful games I've ever played. They're games a lot of people like, but I think they are among the worst games that a lot of people like in terms of design. And this is not because people are stupid or have low standards. It's not a bad thing about you if you like a game that has design problems, we said before. But then I said I wouldn't coddle people more. These games often have truly atrocious tutorials, like truly awful tutorials. Now, I have friends who play these games, and I'm a person who plays games for a living, so it's not a very big problem for me. But I noticed as I played them, wow, the beginning of the game really heavily assumes you are going to play through this at any cost, and isn't really worried about whether that part is fun or you get to do anything well designed and clear. It doesn't really matter. And I just noticed, because it is my job to notice these things, that I was using a skill I usually don't have to when I played those games. I can get through this fine, but why does it need to be like this? And then a lot of the time I felt like the game didn't really direct you to the fun. It was fine with saying, Monster Hunter is a big franchise, like, why this is fun, so just do it the fun way. And I would say, well, what do you think is the fun gameplay loop? Game, do you have any comment on that? Are you going to focus me on that? These are not good things in game design. They're not the end of the world, but because Monster Hunter is very popular, I think they just didn't deign it to be important, and that is a flaw. And it just wouldn't cost enough resources, development resources, that I'm convinced that it really isn't worth it. I think it's propped up by sales and community support that they feel like it wouldn't be worth it. But it probably actually would be, in my opinion, if they took the time to make it accessible. And you know what? Not to say I told you so, because I don't know if this is why, but some recently more accessible Monster Hunter games, Rise comes to mind, have indeed been kind of breakout successes for the genre, arguably partly because they have these more accessible bits. And a lot of people who've been in the franchise for a long time don't like those games as much because they feel like they're less I don't know, of the experience they're familiar with. But that's obviously not really a game design critique, is it? It's that they don't like them. And that's okay. That's fine, good, I guess, that they enjoyed and they knew what they liked about the other games. But that doesn't mean it's bad. In fact, it's arguably pretty good. Again, not to be too mean, but like for sales of the game. So I don't mean to say I told you so, but like a lot of those games have been very successful. So so that's a lot of this point one. The last thing would be there are a lot of games that are, it's a well designed thing the game is doing, but it's been done so much that people who've played a lot of them are inevitably going to eye roll a little bit and not like it. But it's not necessarily that the design itself is bad, it's just so redundant with other existing games that unless it happens to be that you were the first person to play this one, you just probably won't like it that much. A really classic example is the Ubisoft. I never know which one to say. Ubisoft is funnier, so I'm going to say that one. And Ubisoft is a very funny, silly company that makes the same game over and over again. But I mean, I don't think a lot of things in that game are like so badly designed as much as they're just unbelievably redundant with existing games. Like they are identical, almost identical to existing games in their own series. Far Cry is a good example. I really liked Far Cry 3, and I bet if I wiped Far Cry 3 from my memory and played Far Cry 6, I would really like it. But I'm not going to like it now because I've played it before, more or less. And by I'm not going to like it now, I mean I refunded it. I wanted to see what that nostalgic franchise to me would be like, and it's the same. It's nostalgic because it's the same. Finally, obviously, we need to put a note in here for nostalgia itself is an important part of this first topic. This first point heavily requires that we acknowledge that people like things that they get. They like things that feel familiar, but that doesn't mean it's good for them to be familiar. It's very, very easy to do nostalgia. Game design learns from previous game design. There will be games that you find nostalgic, even if nobody copies word for word the homework of the other game's game design. So I personally think it is not a good idea to make a game that is trying to rely on nostalgia. That is inherently not valuable, but propped up by the fact that people will automatically find it kind of comforting or pleasant. Nor are we denying those people their nostalgia by not making those games. They will see design that echoes the design they've seen in the past, even if we don't go out of our way to do it. So while this isn't really what this parlay is trying to do, I will make a note that I think that is one thing you can decide is maybe not that valuable, which is nostalgia. At the very released, if you want to release a game, at the very released, you will have a game that will cloud its data. You will not know if people really liked it as much as if they're just guaranteed to respond kind of positively because they liked that in the past. And of course, there'll be people that say this is the same as everything else, but that'll happen no matter what you make. And all these criticisms will happen no matter what you make. A big rule of the internet and making things on the internet is that you will eventually get every possible response any human could have to anything that you do. So you as a creator need to go in with the expectation that that doesn't really matter, and I need some method to figure out what the real responses are. And that is kind of what we're doing in this parlay, isn't it? We're trying to figure out, of the things people feel about this game, which ones are like useful. And again, one way to do it, the tool from this first point I'm making, is you can think about whether they are responses that anyone would have for anything that fulfills this role. Any multiplayer game will get people saying they had fun playing it with their friends. So it's not that that critique is wrong, and that critique might be coming from the game doing something right, but it's more effective to just ignore all of that feedback because it's something that you would expect to see regardless of what game you made. Likewise, if a game is similar to a game that came out in the past, positive or negative feedback about how it's similar could be largely ignored because you would get that feedback no matter what you made if it was similar to something that came out in the past. What feedback then remains? Well, you could be reductive and say, it's what people can explain, but we'll get back to that later. What is there a reason people can tell you for why this mechanic works well? But again, we'll get back to that later. Point number 2, what can more people enjoy? What's more accessible fun? This is maybe an obvious approach. What is something that is fun, but The most simple. Fun in a way that the most people can enjoy. The most people having fun isn't necessarily the most fun for the people that are having fun with it. I believe in people enjoying something, but like less, and then maybe less people enjoy a thing, but they enjoy it more per person. And you could argue that in this oversaturated economy of information and video games, certainly, it's better to have something that is a quality of enjoyment than quantity. You don't need a lot of people to enjoy a game. It's better for people to enjoy the game more, but just less people enjoy it. Of course, this is financially risky. You have to get the game to get to enough people that you make money, and games generally don't feel the ability to upcharge because people are enjoying them more, though that's not entirely true. There are definitely games that are beloved or people have a lot of confidence in that are expensive. You know, Hades 2 is I think $30. That is a lot more expensive than other surface level equivalent games, and I think a lot of people are willing to pay that because it's really good at the things it's doing well, and people like those things. I was really interested in a previous parlay that included some discussion of Hades, where a lot of you chimed in and said you really don't like Hades. I'm not really that surprised to hear that. For me, evaluating Hades as being such a good design because it's focused, well, that almost means that a lot of people will object to some parts of it because it's focused. That doesn't automatically make it good or me right, but it's just interesting to note, like, a lot of people very critical of games. A lot of you doing parlay are very critical of games. We're more critical than normal of a game I think is one of the better games in terms of, you know, its game design overall, but also like build system stuff, which I know is a mutual interest for a lot of us. That's interesting, isn't it? And so I think that's also a kind of takeaway transition point. You might expect a game to receive more criticism if it's better designed, because better designed often means more specific. But it depends what that criticism is. Again, a lot of the time it's like the criticism will be of something the game wasn't trying to do well. It would be good if it did do it well, but is it the end of the world if it doesn't do that perfectly? Maybe not. Whereas if you criticize a thing the game is trying to do well, it should have done that thing well, I think. For me, keepsakes in Hades, for example, these are a thing I would come down like a little harder on because I think it's not that bad, but there's something the game was trying to do well. The game is significantly about your build decisions, and keepsakes are a big one that you have a lot of control over, but they're not. It's not that deep of a decision tree, in my opinion. In Hades 2, they did this a lot better in my evaluation. Also, the Mirror of Night, the kind of reworked version of that passive upgrade tree. There's not that many decision systems, and you have a few key choices in those two, but they didn't do it that well in Hades 1 because the game is trying to do that well, trying to be focused on that. I think that's a bigger point of contention. I seem to have argued exactly against my second point. So I guess the parlay is taking a turn. I wrote in my notes that point two is, what can more people enjoy? More easily accessible fun. But I have learned from doing this parlay with you that I do not think that is good. So just kidding, this point is, make more specific games. And that would be more objectively fun. That sounds kind of weird, doesn't it? But here's why I think that. So it won't be more objectively fun, meaning for more people. But for the thing it's doing well, you'll be able to do something that is more unarguably good for the game's goal. For people who like the thing the game is doing, because you've specified so much, it becomes easier to be more objective, to say, now that we know very specifically what you want, it's easier to say, giving you multiple loadouts is going to be a useful feature. I can know that more because the game is more about making builds. If the game is a time trial, you're trying to race against someone who's trying to kill all the enemies as quickly as possible, it's more objectively relevant to that game to add a leaderboard because the whole thing is you're racing and people who like getting a better time might like to see what the other times are. It makes you feel like there's other players there. Personally, I don't care about this at all, but I think if I made a game that had it, it would occur to me to add it because it's just so specific. That game design is so specific. You as a game designer will think of the things that would be better for the design more easily if it's more specific, because they will feel obvious by comparison. It won't be in Persona 5, there's this feature that tells you what other people did on any given day with their free time. Why? It can be kind of interesting sometimes, but without context, it's often really weird to see, like, some days people just did a big spike of one thing and you think, did they just see that other people did this thing here and decided to go do it? Now, part of the reason it's included, I think, is to help people with analysis paralysis. You have a very open-ended web of decisions you can make. And so this lets you make a decision you can feel confident is good, even if you don't know what you want to do. But I have a question. Is that really that good? Like, shouldn't the game just be focused on you needing to make decisions and then have the confidence to not help the player make them to that extent? Make it clear what would be beneficial, but not feel like they need to make sure the player, like, can't make a decision if the game is about making decisions, if that makes sense. There's an argument both ways, but I think you see my point. It's maybe a little bit more subjective whether that is a good thing to include because the game is a little more broad. Though it's interesting to note, going back to the previous section, that Persona 5 has some examples that I cleverly included in this sequence of things that are more objectively fun features given the first point, given, like, what will people be annoyed by if they aren't biased by what they personally feel, like getting through the slow final turns of a turn-based fight. I mentioned that earlier. Persona 5 has a pretty involved solution to that, which is very, very called for in that game, because when you hit an enemy with the appropriate elemental damage type, they stun, and then if every enemy is stunned, you can do an all-out attack, which will largely wipe basic enemies. And this is good because, tactically speaking, you've won the fight. Chipping away at the rest of their HP doesn't really do anything different than you just winning now, but it just takes longer. And so, while it might seem a little odd, or some people might interpret it as cheesy, but if you saw how the fighting would go if you didn't have that ability, you would probably then come to agree it basically just saves you time while letting you play the chess of what moves do I do at the right time. I don't think Persona 5's combat is that deep, I'm sorry, but whatever, you get the point. It's interesting to see how that logic helps you decide, well, that kind of removes an annoyance. If people don't have the annoyance, it's like fine, and if they do have the annoyance, you really want to remove the annoyance. So maybe that knowing our own interests, knowing our own perspective point from before, has become remove annoyances. That's more likely to objectively improve how fun something is than to, like, add a feature that people may or may not like. And then making your game more focused makes it more likely that adding features will add features that people who like the game will like, basically. It makes it easier to add focus things. This is going better and differently than I thought. What's my third point? What would be fun if people had more and more perspective? Oh no. Yeah. So here we go. Yes, this is where we open the Pandora's box of what would or could be instead. Steve Jobs famously advertised that a good way to make a lot of money is to imagine what people could want if it was available, rather than thinking about what people do want. You can make a trend and ambush it, taking it all for yourself, if you can imagine what people would want if it was on offer, rather than just what people do want right now. This is also a really elegant way to resolve a problem that entertainers and economists alike often have, which is assuming that people know what they want. They don't. It's very hard to do that. Even people who spend almost all of their time thinking about what they do want don't, in any way, have the ability to know exactly what they would or wouldn't enjoy. That's very hard. You mostly just gain the ability to notice that you can't know whether you will like a thing or not, which is valuable, sure, but only just. And so it's interesting when you play a game to consider that if you want to make something new and exciting, you need to have some system to determine what would be fun for people, not using data they're giving you now. What creates fun? What types of moments are fun? Yes, this is where we get into a much less basic version of objective fun and start talking about things like psychology. Look, what about games is fun? Why do people play games? Why do people want to play games? We're not going to do the whole thing right here because that's a huge topic and is, to be blunt, really a lot more about psychology and human thinking than it is about game design, and isn't all that actionable immediately. Just to say, I think that line of thinking is very helpful. Here's the version of it I think we're going to do for this parlay. There are a lot of things that people come to games for, and there are lots of ways you could make those things fun. But out of the things that people might want fulfilled by a game, you can look through them and try to figure out, okay, but what are they motivated by? When somebody wants to feel like they're the best in a game, why do they want to feel that way? Are they the best at the game? Or is the conversation kind of rigged from the start? Well, yeah, I mean, they're not the best in any meaningful way. They spent more time on it maybe, or whatever. And if other people didn't have the time to spend on it, and you just did have the time to spend on it, and then the game says you're the best, should you really feel like you achieved something and you're better than other people? No, not really, but people often do. What I'm suggesting is to interrogate that motivation and think, but would you want that if you thought about it more and more and more and more as you mature and play more games and play more of this game? Is that a good reason to want that? Is there a good reason to want to feel that fulfillment? And if there isn't, maybe making your whole game stand up on that feeling isn't as good of an idea. And it's better to have the game stand up on a feeling that feels more enduring. Like, the game creates a lot of genuinely unique scenarios, recombining different effects and multipliers, making a build system. I would argue that the desire for human novelty is a pretty deep-seated desire. This is not a maturity speed bump that people move past. This is something humans just like. It's just inherently interesting to explore and see new things. In fact, people who explore and see new things tend to not be as caught up in, like, this is better or worse or whatever. Likewise, in your game's build system, you may find it useful to consider that people who want to just make the best build, that's kind of just immature, rather than being, some people prefer that preference, and I as a game designer refuse to pass judgment on that preference, while other people want this thing, and I also refuse to pass judgment on that. It is beneficial for your game design. It will make humans have more fun. If you're willing to pass some constructive criticism judgment, you don't have to tell them. You can just think it to yourself about whether, well, I'm actually telling people, if you think it's important to be the best at things, that's delusional. I am happy to tell you, but nobody else has to tell anyone that you're not better than other people. It can be useful to consider this and to make a game that is about things that, if people really think about them, will survive that introspection, will survive being thought about. Thinking in the late hours of the night about what will do them good in the game and they'll have fun. It's good to have the game be motivated by something, be focused on something, to value and reward things that players will continue to like upon introspection. And a lot of games really don't do this. Don't pass judgment on this at all. And that's fine. A lot of the time, it's interesting to see how they clearly appeal to people who just want to feel better than others, but also at the same time appeal to people that, you know, are doing their own thing. They just want to make new things and explore. A couple common examples are the Souls-like genre and looter shooters. Often have this feeling like the game doesn't clearly pass judgment on, like, killing the boss better or like winning the mission faster, more decisively, but players often add in that decision. They add in the idea that it is better to do these things in a certain way. It's better to beat the Souls-like without using these effects. It's better to do the harder raid content, even though the only reward is better gear to do more raids. If it gives different abilities, you are kind of making the game about being better than other people. Should you do that? You can decide for yourself. People have and have not. But a problem that is obviously outside the scope of this parlay is, how do you make a game that doesn't reward the misguided things people do value now and instead rewards the things people would value if they got enough time to think about it? Ooh. One thing to consider is that a lot of games are long enough that you can meaningfully change what people think. You can meaningfully change the personality of your player as you go. Not by a huge amount, but meaningfully. Just not by an ocean of distance, but by some amount. You can change it a little during the runtime of your game. And a lot of games that I think are doing something pretty interesting do this. They try to give you time to develop an opinion about something in the game and then ask you to kind of pass judgment on it, often narratively. A really good example is Nier Automata. I think a lot of people who didn't enjoy Nier Automata's narrative, it's probably because I don't think a lot of games have prepared anyone for doing this. I admit at first when I played Nier Automata, thinking through it, I thought, why is this part here? I'm not sure this part needs to be here. I won't tell you which because it's a spoiler, but you'll know when you play it. There's a part of the game that I thought, does this need to be here? Now, I feel like, having played through the whole game, I know exactly why they put that in. I'm quite confident I know why they thought it was good to include that part, but I don't know if I agree that that was worth putting in like that. I don't know. I would really like to hear from someone who liked it and needed what that part was doing, I guess is to say. I guess I want to be a little cynical for a second and say, I'm not sure the developers have any way to know if people would want that part in the game. Did they do this discussion and think, not maybe what would be objectively fun, but what do people objectively need? What pieces do people need? Did they watch people play each part of the game and then like give them a psych evaluation? Because if they didn't, that's fine. That sounds kind of crazy to do, but like, how would you know if that part needed to be there? Do you see what I mean? They guessed that that part needed to be there. And I think it was a reasonable guess. Again, I think I understand why they put it in, but did it need to be there? This is a hard thing to know. So I guess you could say objective fun can be detected a little bit by playtesting, not by listening to the playtester's every word, but by putting a thing in with a hypothesis for why it would be fun, and then actually checking if it is necessary to put that in the game to generate the fun that you need. This is hard to do. For one, you kind of need like an endless stream of new playtesters, fresh eyes on a game that you can talk to very in depth, not just taking notes. Though I would suggest that you can at the very least probably replace normal playtesting with that to some extent. You don't need to do the same amount of normal playtesting and this. You can probably have like half of your playtesting budget just be this, and then do some normal playtesting to find normal playtesting things, bugs, and general like gameplay flow things you just didn't think to take this route through the game. But what about the way you did think people would play through the game? Does that like work? Is it fun in that way? What are the moments where it works well? And rather than talking about objective fun, we've really gotten into the realm of how do you make a game more fun for the kinds of people that would like it, and in a way that's more valuable. You can't be sure that a game will be fun. The final note I want to leave on this parlay is that looking for a game to be more objectively fun, I do not think is beneficial if it's motivated by you wanting to like ensure that your thing you're putting out there will be fun to people. You can't do that, I don't think anyway. But you can consider how it would be fun for people and do it on purpose. Think about, I think this is fun. Why? Why do you think that's fun? What's fun about it? Do other people have that experience? If they don't, how do you have that experience? Do you need to have a certain kind of experience to find that fun? Can you put that experience in the game? Because that might work. And does it work? If you put that in, have people try it. Does that experience successfully get them the context you have, and now this thing is fun? Or is there something else? Maybe you got it wrong. It's hard to figure that out. That process of trial and error, in my mind, is really how you can conclude if something is fun. The simple act of just asking other people what they think is fun can also work wonders. You're going to have to sort through a lot of what we talked about in part one, people saying this is fun for this reason specific to this game, but upon inspection you think that's not that specific to that game, really, as far as I can tell. But what can you do? And I still think that getting people's feedback is helpful. Some of it will be things about the game, and taking the simple rhetoric that if they can explain their reasoning for what in the game design is the fun, Sure, maybe that's a place to investigate. That's not enough on its own, but maybe those are the ones to look at, if that makes sense. Well, thank you for the parlay, Hank. I'm glad that you picked this thought bubble because I had a lot more to say about it than I thought I did, as is usually the case with these. Folks, if you'd like your own parlay like this one, you can get one using a link in the description. And again, you can submit whatever you want. It doesn't have to be one of my ideas. I only present a few of these so that the few people that have parlay and want to use it every month, but just don't have a topic in mind, you can get one of these and have a little podcast that interests you more without having to come up with an idea, should you wish not to. It's there if you want it. Looking forward to the next one.